Hey everyone, Mike from VSwitch0 here. So what's riskier than buying a broken 3DFX card? Probably buying 3 of them. Yeah, after successfully fixing my Voodoo 5, I think my renewed confidence went to my head a bit. And did I make a wise decision here buying 3 defective cards, or am I way in over my head? I guess there's only one way to find out. So in front of me here, I have 3 3DFX Voodoo 3 3000 cards. Wow, that's a lot of 3s now that I say that. And it's really a card that I have many fond memories of. After I used my original Voodoo for a few years, it began to show its age eventually, especially with the lack of memory, which made it incompatible with some newer games. But back in 99 or 2000, I replaced it with a brand new Voodoo 3 3000. And wow, what a huge step up it was. Amazing 3D performance, much higher resolutions, terrific 2D image quality, and best of all, no more multiple cards and pass-through cables. It really felt like the future. And I don't know whatever happened to my old 3000, but I expect I gave it away after upgrading to a GeForce 3. But yeah, a decision I very much regret today, unfortunately. I've been keeping an eye out for a Voodoo 3 3000 for a few years, but the prices were always beyond what I was willing to shell out for, and really, they're only getting worse. I did find a Voodoo 3 2000 a couple of years ago for a decent price, but it still wasn't quite what I was looking for. Yeah, realistically, are they almost the same? Yes, but I wanted that same card I loved back in the day with that big, oversized aluminum heatsink and, you know, that 166 megahertz premium clock speed. So I'm always keeping an eye out for 3DFX gear on eBay, and I saw an auction from a recycler with 3 cards for sale. All were tested and determined to be defective. The auction had actually been going for a very long time, but the price was just too high and nobody bought any of them. Then one day I just happened to notice that the seller suddenly dropped the price by over 30%, and that certainly did get my attention. I did consider buying one, but what if I got the dud of the lot? But then, I started thinking, and that's really 3 broken cards for about the price of 1 working one. Even if I could fix one of them, I'd be okay with the deal. 2, that'd be totally awesome. And 3 cards, unlikely, but yeah, who knows? At the very least, it could be fun trying, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I went and bought all 3. So the seller did test all 3 cards, and they all have the exact same symptom, which is no VGA output at all. Apparently the test system wouldn't boot at all with the cards installed, and the seller does seem to deal with a lot of computer hardware, so I really have no reason to doubt this, and I think it's pretty unlikely that it's just a compatibility problem or something simple like that. It's a bit of a risky symptom to deal with, unfortunately. It could mean a lot of things. I mean, the cards could be completely fried, or it could actually be something simple. In some ways, I do prefer this, though, to, artifacting and stability problems, because those issues can definitely be harder to fix. So really, there's only one way to sort of, figure out the state of these cards, and that's to test them. So to keep track of them, I've very affectionately named them Card 1, Card 2, and Card 3. So Card 1 and 2 at the top here are actually identical. They're both from Gateway Systems and shipped with BIOS version 1.2. They have 166 megahertz Vanguard memory, which is a manufacturer you don't see too often. Card number 3 is a slightly older revision that came out of a Dell machine. It's shipped with an old 1.10 BIOS, and it has the more familiar Hyundai memory chips on it. All 3 of the cards actually look pretty good, really. No obvious signs of PCB damage or missing components on them. Card 1 does have a very slightly bent heatsink corner here. A little bit worrying, since this means it was probably dropped or banged around at some point. Card 2 looks okay, aside from a capacitor that's bent and a bit loose and another one that's dented a little bit. It's also a little bit dirtier than the other 2, but aside from that, it looks okay. And Card 3, the Dell one, actually looks about perfect. I really don't see anything amiss at all. So in some ways that's great, but again, it also means that it won't be as simple as soldering on a missing component or something like that. Alright, so let's get started to work on these cards one at a time. It's going to take a bit of time here, so wish me luck. Caffeine recharge. So we're going to start here with card number 1, the Gateway card with the slightly dented heatsink. I'm going to be using my Asus A7V133 system with an Athlon 700 for testing here today. This is the same system I used to test my Voodoo 5 recently. So now for the moment of truth. Does it post? Not looking promising so far. Nope. No display output at all. Doesn't look like the VGA BIOS is initializing at all, and well, at least it seems in line with what the eBay seller was saying. So just because a card isn't initializing at boot doesn't necessarily mean that it's completely dead. I'm going to install a secondary card in the system to see if I can get it to boot. This is just an S3 Verge PCI card that I know is in good working order. The system should try to initialize this PCI card before the Voodoo 3, and so long as the video BIOS loads, the system should boot up. So let's see what happens here. And yep, looks like it's booting just fine with the S3 Verge card in the system. So this machine here is running Windows 2000 Professional, and it already has the Amiga Merlin Voodoo drivers installed that support the Voodoo 3. And right off the bat, we see a very encouraging sign. The Voodoo 3 is actually detected, and I'm prompted to install the driver. So here in the device manager, it looks exactly as I'd expect. The driver is loaded without issue, and I can see the system resources assigned too. The great thing about Windows 2000 is that it has pretty robust multi-monitor support. You can use 2 video cards to drive 2 different displays, and in the display properties page you can see that both cards and 2 monitors are available. Obviously only monitor 1 is actually connected right now. But what I'm going to do here is enable the Voodoo 3 by clicking the Extend My Windows Desktop checkbox. And I'm also going to set it as the primary monitor. And when I hit Apply, if I'm lucky, the Voodoo 3 should start displaying a VGA signal. So let's see what happens here. So with the system still up, I'm just going to move the VGA cable from the Verge to the Voodoo 3. And bingo, we have 2D display output. So the card must be working to some degree. Let's see if we can get a glide game to run. I'm just going to go ahead here and launch GLQuake and see if it's stable under 3D load. And hey, look at that. It's running. I'm not seeing any artifacting. Seems nice and smooth. I'm obviously going to need to give it a proper stress test, but that's amazing. Very encouraging. So what could this mean exactly? It sounds to me like this card either has a corrupted or incompatible VBIOS that's preventing it from initializing at boot. The card's obviously functioning properly once the driver loads, so I think that's definitely the best place to start. I'm going to reflash the appropriate Voodoo 3 BIOS on it, and we'll see what happens. So to do this, you'll need bootable DOS media. The 3DFX Flash utility doesn't support NT or 2000. I'm just going to use a virtual floppy that I created on my Gotek emulator here for this purpose. The 3DFX Flash utility is very basic. There's next to no options for configuration. It's also a bit of a quirky tool that needs to be used pretty cautiously. There's a number of VBIOS files available for the Voodoo 3, and some just really don't work well with certain card revisions. I'd really recommend against flashing a Voodoo 3 unless you really need to for some reason, and definitely make sure you have a PCI video card that you can use just in case you brick it somehow. In my case here, I'm going to use the 2.15.12 VBIOS, which is a much newer one than the 1.2 the card came with. This version does appear to work well with older OEM cards, and just wanted to give a big thanks to Slybots for providing me with this file and also giving me some guidance on the flashing process. I'm going to include a link in the description where you can find a number of VBIOS files for the Voodoo 3, and you can also find the flashing tools there as well. And there we go. Looks like it was flashed successfully. So let's reboot the system and see what happens. So I'm just going to remove the S3 Verge from the system here and hook the VGA cable back up to the Voodoo 3. And this is the moment of truth. Bingo! The Voodoo 3 BIOS is now loading at startup. Fantastic. Looks like the BIOS was either just corrupted or the previous owner bricked it somehow while trying to update it. Sadly, I accidentally overwrote the old BIOS that was backed up during the flash, so I guess I'll never know. But the card now appears to be working perfectly. I did an extended session in Quake 3, and I'm feeling very confident that this card is good. Time for another caffeine recharge. Alright, so moving on to card number 2, the second gateway card with the sketchy capacitors. And again, for the moment of truth, nothing. Looks like we got one long post beep followed by 3 short ones. Pretty sure that's a no video card detected post failure for the award BIOS. So yeah, let's get the S3 Verge installed again and see if the card works at all in Windows. And that's not very encouraging. So card's not detected at all. It doesn't show up in the device manager in either the display adapters or other devices section. It's literally as if the card isn't in the system at all. In an interesting turn of events, I installed my post analyzer card and I put the case on its side so that I could see the digits easier.
What?
And incredibly, this system posted just fine.
No way.
It was a little flaky though. Even slightly touching the card would cause the system to hang. And no matter what I did, putting the case vertically again would just cause the card to be completely undetected. Just very strange. It seems that, just the force of gravity pulling down on the card is enough to cause it to stop functioning. It was definitely time to inspect this one a lot more carefully, I think. I didn't see any bad solder joints or obvious signs of damage aside from some traces on the rear of the card. As you can see here, the solder mask is scratched off and the bare copper is exposed. It looks worse than it is though, and it appears to be just superficial. I did check the traces with a multimeter just to be sure, and they were all fine. And in fact, the traces appear to be going to TV output chips that don't even exist on this card anyway, so I'm really not too concerned about that. As I mentioned before, this card was a little dustier than the other two, so I cleaned the AGP connector with isopropyl alcohol. It had some kind of a sticky residue on it, and after cleaning it, I was actually pretty shocked to see just how dirty it was. I really didn't expect it to do very much, but amazingly, the card started working perfectly fine afterward. I could put the case vertically again, and unless I wiggled the card pretty substantially, I mean, granted, I really shouldn't do that with the system running anyway, the system was just perfectly stable. Even that issue with wiggling seemed to be solved after I reinserted the AGP Pro slot protector, just a small piece of plastic that helps non-AGP Pro cards stay aligned better in the slot. Cards like the Voodoo 3 have an end notch that should help to keep it aligned, but it definitely felt a little more secure in the slot with the plastic bit installed. Well, I gave the card a nice long loop of 3D Mark 2001, and I'm pretty confident that it's working just fine now. I never imagined that a dirty AGP connector would be the cause, but hey, I'm not going to argue with that. But I'm not quite done with this card yet. I really don't like the way the electrolytic capacitors look. And as I mentioned before, one has a nice dent in the can and another is bent over pretty badly and is a bit loose. Even though the card appears to be stable, I think this one's a perfect candidate for a full recap. Thankfully, the caps are very common 10 microfarad surface mount models. I actually ordered a bag of 50 of them recently for a couple of projects, so I've got plenty. These are Panasonic FK series caps, great all-purpose low ESR models that should be perfect for this card. So there's a number of ways to remove surface mount caps like this, but my favorite method is to simply cut the top off with snips. I find this to be the safest way, and it just helps to prevent lifting pads. I try to cut them near the bottom where the groove in the can is, and just be sure to always cut in the same direction, parallel to the pads. Once you've got the top off, you'll see the pins visible. You just need to pry off the remaining bit of can, which should come off very easily. Next, you'll want to cut off the top of each of the two pins. They're a little bit thicker than the opening in the base, so it'll make things easier. Just be careful because they do tend to go flying. You don't want a tiny bit of metal shorting your card out somehow. Once you have the tops of the pins cut off, you should now be able to remove the plastic base very easily. And all that's left now is just the remaining bits of pin on the pads that'll need to be cleaned up. So let's get the rest of them removed. I'm just adding a bit of flux paste to the pads here, and I'm going to remove the remaining bits of capacitor pins with a soldering iron. It's very easy to just brush the pins right off. They tend to stick to the iron and you can just tap them off. Next, I'll need to remove the old solder from the pads using a bit more flux and some solder wick. And after that, the pads are looking good. Just doing some quick cleanup with some IPA in preparation for the new ones here. I noticed that Necroware brushes paper towel with IPA like this when doing repairs, and it actually works really well. Seems to absorb more of the flux residue this way. Next, I'm just going to add some fresh flux to the pads in preparation for the new caps. There's many different ways to solder on surface mount caps, but my favorite way is just to add some solder on one of the two pads on each. I can then heat up the pad and just slide the capacitor into place. It's sometimes tricky to get them aligned just right, but it is easy to reflow the pad again if any adjustments are needed. Once they're all attached on one side, I just go and solder the remaining side using a finer tip on my iron. When the cap is in place, there really isn't much pad or pin exposed, so having a finer tip does help here quite a bit. And there we go. They're all on there and they look pretty good to me. Just going to do a bit of a final cleanup with some IPA, and I'd call that successful. And last but not least, it seems only appropriate to give the card a BIOS flash to the same 2.15.12 revision that I did for the first card. Wasn't really necessary, but there have been some video mode fixes implemented over time. If it was worth doing a recap, I figure it's worth doing a BIOS flash too. I really can't believe the main problem with this card was dirt, but hey, I've seen weirder things. And at least it got a fresh set of caps and a new BIOS, and it's back in business. Better go with decaf this time, I think. So last up is the Dell card with Hyundai memory. This one's a little bit older with a 1.10 BIOS revision, and unlike the others, it's clean and in perfect physical condition from what I can see. But let's power it up and see what happens. And sure enough, just like the other two, we get no video output at all. But thankfully the card seems to work just fine in Windows when I boot it up with the S3 Verge installed. It was detected just fine, and jailquake demos looped without issue. Could it just be another bricked VBIOS maybe? I wish I could say it was as simple as flashing the card like it was with the first one, but I ran into all sorts of problems trying to get a BIOS written to this card. The 3DFX Flash utility couldn't seem to detect the hardware build information, and it was very happy to erase the flash memory only to fail to write the BIOS to the card. If it wasn't already bricked, it definitely was now. It would also keep complaining about an unknown Flash EEPROM manufacturer for some reason, as if the BIOS chip on the card wasn't supported by the 3DFX Flash utility. Very strange and unlikely because it's the exact same Atmel 64K chip on all three cards that I have. I thought that the chip may have gone bad actually, so I even ordered one just in case. I thought it may be due to the older revision of the card, but even a Dell-specific Voodoo 3 BIOS failed to flash with the same problem. It also seems to detect these older Voodoo 3 BIOS files as belonging to a Banshee for some reason. Not sure what's up with that. Later, I tried to take a dump of the existing BIOS using a third-party utility, and to my surprise, it actually dumped the S3 Verge BIOS instead of the Voodoo 3, which got me thinking, maybe the Flash utility was trying to write the Voodoo BIOS image to the Verge. I mean, that would certainly explain why it thinks the EEPROM is not supported anyway. On a hunch, I decided to boot the system up with the S3 Verge in a different slot. Maybe it has something to do with the PCI bus addressing. Who knows? At any rate, it was worth a shot. And amazingly, that did the trick. The Flash utility was more than happy to write the BIOS to the card now, and after removing the Verge and rebooting, it seems to be working beautifully. I left the card to loop jailquake demos and 3D Mark 01 for a while, never missed a beat. I would say this thing is fixed. Well, I've got to say, I did not expect to get all three cards working again. I thought maybe one, two if I was lucky, but I never imagined all three. I'm very thankful, but honestly, this is really not the norm when it comes to buying defective hardware in my experience. I've had my fair share of disappointments, including a couple of Voodoo 2s that I just haven't had any luck repairing yet. It really is a bit of a gamble. There's just so many things that can go wrong with old hardware like this. But hey, this particular time, the stars aligned and I really lucked out. So that's great that I fixed all three, but what on earth am I going to do with 3 Voodoo 3s now? Well, I really only need one to add to my collection, and I don't like hoarding duplicates that I really don't need. I definitely want to get these back into the hands of other retro enthusiasts out there, and I'll probably sell or trade one because I'd really like to get another 12 meg Voodoo 2 card at some point. And the third, well, stay tuned for more of that one. I won't say any more for now. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video and like to see more retro content like this, please be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help smaller YouTube channels like mine get more exposure. Thanks again.